Evening, everyone, and welcome. I will first make our land acknowledgement. This place where we gather is in the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor these teachings. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to say a few words about the program committee. It's made up of people who are on the NLC board, and some who are community volunteers, folks who join for a short period without a big commitment, perhaps because they have a strong interest in the topic that's being explored. And often they stay on because they really enjoy it and have a great experience. They may not even live in Northumberland County, thanks to the wonders of the internet and Zoom meetings. What these people have in common is a desire to learn new things like all of you, and the ability to contribute a few hours a month to doing research and connecting with potential speakers. Tonight's event is happening because one of those community members, Mark Shea, who's sitting here, joined the program committee when it was developing the migration program. Mark lives in Toronto. He came across Melissa Kelly's work and invited her to join us tonight. If you want to ask Mark about his experience as an NLC volunteer later, I'm sure he'll oblige. Now about Dr. Melissa Kelly. She studies immigration policy, patterns, and integration in rural and remote areas. She is leading a research project on this subject as it applies in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Currently affiliated with Toronto Metropolitan University, Melissa studied at the University of Free State in South Africa and at Uppsala University, a public research university in Sweden founded in 1477, a little earlier than Toronto Metropolitan University. In addition to her academic pursuits, Melissa has contributed extensively to the development of labor market and immigration policies and programs for the Government of Canada. She is on the Welcoming Standard Content Advisory Board for Welcoming America. So I'd like to introduce Melissa Kelly.
Testing. All right, we're good. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm truly excited to be part of this wonderful series. I'm so glad you chose the topic of migration. I personally think it's the most exciting topic in the entire world, so I'm always happy to find other people who are interested in the topic as well. So I'm genuinely excited to come here and have this, what I hope will be a conversation with you. I study smaller communities, so I also always love the opportunity to visit smaller communities, including Cobourg, so I'm super happy to be here. Unfortunately, with the rain, I didn't get to see too much today, but I'll try my luck again tomorrow. And if that doesn't work, I will be back later in the summer because it looks like an absolutely beautiful community that you have here. So today I'm going to be talking about migration, international migration, to smaller centers in other parts of Ontario. So just going to give you a quick overview of my presentation before we get into it. So basically I'll talk a little bit about the broader trends, so what is happening in smaller communities across the province, and talk about the implications of this, so some of the benefits, some of the challenges, things to think about. Then I want to really dive into the experiences of a couple specific places that I've studied through my research. So one of these is Grey and Bruce counties, combined counties. And here really the main focus will be on how a community has mobilized to become more welcoming to newcomers in a very short time. So by that I mean really the last 10 years. This is an area that previously wasn't very aware of migration, and now the opposite is the case. Next, I will talk about Thunder Bay in Northern Ontario. And here I won't be talking about the community in general, but more about communities within communities, and specifically how diasporic or ethnic communities have made for a soft landing for some incoming migrants through their networks. So that's sort of the bulk of my presentation. Then I'll conclude with, some overall comments and conclusions. So just to begin, when you think of diversity, you probably don't think of small towns, at least not in the Canadian context. You probably think of big cities like Toronto, and maybe even you yourselves go to Toronto occasionally to enjoy certain festivals, try certain types of food. These are things that are generally associated with the metropolis, not with the town or with rural areas. And this makes sense because for a long time, international migrants haven't been very attracted to smaller communities. So when European migrants started coming to Canada in the 18th century, they actually sought out land. So many, as we know, went to the prairies. They were looking for space. This is not true of most post-war migrants coming from mostly other continents and other parts of the world. They have definitely shown a preference for the MTV, as we like to call it, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, by a lot. And if we look at Ontario itself, by far the majority of international migrants go directly to Toronto. This is because there's a perception that that's where the opportunities are. Sort of post-industrialization, there's been a concentration of jobs and capital in cities, so people go to these places expecting to find success. It's also often where they have networks. We have chain migration, right? People move from one country, get established, and then others follow. This has mostly been the case in larger cities, not smaller ones. So we have developed these patterns, but now there's been a little bit of a shift back towards regionalization. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Increasingly, international migrants are finding themselves in smaller towns, and there's a few different reasons for this. So one is they're actually starting to hear about these places, because imagine you're sitting, say, in India. You've probably only heard of the MTV. You're not even considering other destinations because you've never even heard of them. But after you move to Toronto, you start hearing about places like Cobourg. You start seeing, perhaps on a visit, how beautiful they are. Maybe you find that housing is more affordable. Maybe there's less competition for jobs, so you actually decide to settle there. So this is a phenomenon that's been happening gradually, little by little over time, mostly in smaller cities like this one that are proximate to a larger city that receives a lot of migrants. It's a little bit more difficult to attract international migrants to less proximate places that might not be on people's radar. The second is there's new actors playing a role here, and I'm sure you've heard a lot in the news these days about what universities have been doing in terms of migration. Many of them have opened up to international students, especially in the province of Ontario, due to a lack of provincial funding for education. So they rely on the tuition dollars of international students. So now they've become, in a way, major players in the immigration domain, which wasn't the case previously. And these universities and colleges are not exclusively in urban areas. In fact, many of them are in smaller communities and were initially meant to serve the local population, but are now serving international student populations. Similarly, employers have also started to play a major role in determining where people actually go. And this is due in part to the out-migration of so many youth, for example, from smaller towns going to larger cities. Now there's labor shortages, and employers are saying, hey, we have to bring in international migrants. And the government's responded to that by creating international migration programs where employers decide who to bring in. And that leads me to my third point, which is there are a number of government policies. So in addition to the labor market policies, there are also policies in place to incentivize migrants to go to non-metropolitan areas. And maybe you've heard about some of these. So for my research, one of the important ones is the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot, which basically selected 11 small centers across the country to test whether it might be possible to let communities decide who to bring in and based on their own labor market needs, and whether or not newcomers would actually stay for the longer term by doing that. And then there's other policies as well, such as the Atlantic Immigration Pilot and the Ontario Nominee Program, but that is actually for large and small cities. So increasingly, we're seeing new faces in smaller communities, international students, workers, both temporary and permanent, and also refugees. And I forgot to mention this one. So in Canada, as you may know, we have government-assisted refugees. These people go to specific hubs where there are services in place for them, but privately sponsored refugees go wherever there is a community that sponsors them. So this is also a new initiative, and this has also contributed to more immigrants ending up in smaller places. So obviously this presents a number of opportunities. I already touched on the need. Clearly there are labor shortages that need to be filled in a lot of smaller communities. Many smaller communities are experiencing demographic decline, aging populations, out-migration, and in order to survive, they actually need international migrants or somebody to come and boost the population numbers. International migrants have also contributed to economic revitalization through starting businesses, investing. Obviously, when you bring in new people, they spend a lot, especially as they get established. They're buying homes, they're setting up their lives. And thirdly, perhaps this isn't actually a goal of regionalization policy, but it is an outcome. There is increasing cultural diversity in smaller towns. Many smaller towns are no longer homogeneous. They never were, of course, but perhaps there was a perception that they were. But now increasingly we're seeing a mix of people who have come for a whole variety of reasons. Of course, it's not always easy. There's growing pains in this process. Again, referring to the media, we've heard so many stories these days about how there isn't enough housing to support population growth. The reality is, housing policy hasn't kept up necessarily with some of these other strategies that we have for population growth. So yes, in some places, this has been a challenge. We also haven't invested very much in public transportation. This has also proven to be challenging, especially since many migrants, when they first arrive in Canada, by the way, when I use the term migrant, I mean international migrant, when they arrive, they don't have a license, they don't have a car. So it's very difficult to live in a place where you can't get around. It can also be hard to find the right job, even if people are being recruited because there are labor shortages. They may agree to work in those jobs. That doesn't necessarily mean that it meets their aspirations in the longer term. So there's that issue of mismatch between newcomers' qualifications and the jobs available. And finally, social relations. Yes, many small towns are very eager to attract migrants. In fact, it's become a major strategy all the way from the top. The federal government thinks it's a great idea to bring migrants to smaller communities, and many communities agree. However, within those communities, there's a diversity of opinions, of course, and sometimes there's pushback and resistance. Not everybody is comfortable with the change that they're experiencing, whether it's economic, social, or cultural. So with that as a background, I want to delve a little bit deeper into what it actually means to be a welcoming community. Because we often hear that to overcome the challenges of regionalization and to maximize the benefits, we have to create welcoming communities. But this term is a little bit vague, right? On the one hand, it's almost philosophical. It's about being open to the other, receptive. But it's also somewhat practical. We have to be able to identify newcomers' needs and address those needs. And it also comes down really to specific programs and initiatives that address those needs and facilitate integration, because ultimately that's the goal here, right? We want to create prosperous, happy communities where everybody can thrive, more established residents as well as new arrivals. It's generally agreed upon in the academic literature and other literature that in order to create welcoming communities, all stakeholders have to work together. There's no one player here. A local municipal government cannot create a welcoming community on its own. The federal government cannot create a welcoming community on its own. It requires collaboration between different levels of government and people working on the ground in both newcomer-specific services, for example, those who actually work with newcomers, but also the general population. Anybody that interacts with newcomers plays a role in creating a welcoming community. So this could be everybody from teachers to the police to the person issuing driver's licenses. It's important for all of these individuals to understand the needs of newcomers coming into their community and how to address those needs, or at least be open to learning what those needs are and be patient and try to help. Employers are also very important here. They have to be willing to hire newcomers and train newcomers and adapt to them to some extent. It's a two-way street. It's in many cases employers that are very eager to attract migrants, but sometimes they don't show as much interest in the integration piece. But again, everybody has to be engaged, involved. Same goes for universities. They play a role here too. They can't just assume that students will have the exact same needs as Canadian domestic students. They have to adapt to that. There are other stakeholders that are perhaps a bit more obvious, like sponsorship groups who are actually working on the ground to assist refugees coming in, and existing migrant communities who also often play, as I will discuss later, a major role in the reception and support of new arrivals. So now just a brief background on my research on Ontario. So this is part of a bigger project that's looking at small towns in New Zealand and Australia as well, and Alberta, but I'm focused mostly on Ontario myself. And obviously, Ontario is a huge province, and there's a lot of diversity between different cities and towns in Ontario. So my first thought was, how do I even start this research? How do I deal with that, the difference between different locations? So I actually deliberately selected places that I thought would be interesting to compare. So I went for one that's way up north and isolated, Thunder Bay, as you can see there on the map. Hopefully you can see there in the back. Maybe you're all familiar with the geography of Ontario anyways. So Thunder Bay is relatively larger than the other cities in the study. It has a population of close to 115,000, but is very isolated. Then North Bay, much further south, although it's still considered Northern Ontario, has a population of over 50,000, is much less isolated, but still more isolated than many of the communities in Southern Ontario, such as those located in Grey and Bruce, which I'm also going to discuss today. I'm not discussing North Bay because I just finished research in North Bay and I haven't had time to fully analyze it, so maybe on another occasion. So basically what I did is went into these communities to see what was happening, who was coming, what the migration dynamics were, but I also wanted to understand what the communities were doing to actually welcome migrants on the ground, and how migrants were responding to this, how they were experiencing the place. So I spoke with all kinds of stakeholders, many of which were on that list that I showed you before, and I also spoke to newcomers themselves. And I defined newcomer or international migrant very broadly, so anybody who was born abroad qualified to participate in the study. And then I looked at both the newcomer perspective and the community perspective and tried to understand how immigration is actually transforming these communities. How have things really changed as a result of these dynamics taking place? So now let's dig into Grey and Bruce a little bit. I wanted to show you this picture because I think it captures just how gorgeous this area is, as is Cobourg area. Perhaps there's a lot of similarities. Just a little bit about Grey and Bruce counties. I can show you the map here. Just north of Toronto, not a super far commute. There's several different communities inside the counties, ranging from just 500 in population up to 20,000. Owen Sound is 20,000. It can be considered one of the primary hubs. Basically, in the past, it was considered to be kind of a retirement place. So there is some industry. There's Grey and Bruce power there. But the population has aged significantly. And there was this perception that that's just how it was going to be. But actually, migrants have been coming into the region for some time and were simply invisible. So while Grey and Bruce counties kind of thought they were unknown to the world and this little hidden gem, wasn't entirely true. There were people slowly coming in from Toronto, attracted primarily to the lifestyle on offer. Again, some stunning shots. Also relative affordability compared to Toronto. And many came because they had, for example, a spouse from the region. There was also a lot of European migration still to this area, migration from the States, so kind of invisible migration in that sense. But this perception that this was just kind of a white community that's not really connected to anywhere else was pretty much shot down with the development of a few different things, actually. So one of the things that made people in the county feel much more connected to the world was the introduction of, well, international students being allowed to attend Georgian College. Georgian College has a campus in the area. So this led to several hundred students coming into the area. Workers being brought in basically to support the aging population. So many healthcare workers, for example. And what I really want to focus on today is the introduction of private sponsorship programs and the resulting influx of a number of refugees into the area from Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea, and other countries, which was quite significant in Grey and Bruce counties. So basically, although the counties had sponsored refugees in the past, no one paid much attention until 2015 when the Syrian migration crisis hit. And suddenly there was concern across Canada in all different types of communities about how to support Syrians. And Grey and Bruce County was no exception. So they held a town meeting in the basement of a church in Owen Sound and discovered there was a lot of interest in the community to do much more than they had previously done to support refugees. So they immediately organized themselves into sponsorship groups, and the initiative just grew from there. So it began really in a large scale with Syrians. Now there's about 100 Syrians settled in the region, but from there, Afghans, Ukrainians, and other groups as well. Oh, and I just wanted to mention they established something called the Grey and Bruce Newcomers Network, basically to support all of these sponsorship groups that were created. The sponsorship of refugees had a very strong impact on the sponsors, as I'm sure you might imagine. So I wanted to share this quote with you from one private sponsor who was really touched by her experiences of interacting with people that she'd never interacted with before. So she says, "If we are going to live in a just and fair society, I think we need to experience life from different perspectives and different cultures, even the food we eat. Last weekend, I attended a Coptic wedding for the first time, and I've learned how to dance from Northern African dancing styles with shoulders. I'm not sure that I'm really good at articulating why diversity is so important, but I know that it is. There's so many different perspectives that we can learn from." So really, her world, her personal world, has been transformed, perhaps not as much as the refugees that she sponsored, but nevertheless, definitely she's been very touched by this, and she went on to sponsor numerous more refugees. At the same time, interacting with refugees also made many members of the community much more aware of the struggles that migrants experience when they come to smaller towns. Struggles accessing services, operating in a foreign language, trying to find employment without a Canadian reference or without Canadian credentials. So things really started to pick up from that time of sponsorship. And an organization was formed called Welcoming Grey Bruce in 2019, which integrated a bunch of other small grassroots initiatives that had started since the crisis with the Syrians or shortly before. So these other organizations that became part of Welcoming Grey Bruce were doing a number of different things. One was organizing a small festival, just half-a-day event that promoted multiculturalism and diversity. That's the One World Festival. Another was all about bringing different types of stakeholders together to support newcomers. One was about providing support for sponsorship groups. And then another was the one I previously mentioned, which was about actually sponsoring newcomers. So Welcoming Grey Bruce basically thought it would be good to coordinate more effectively than had been done in the past. And this is basically because they learned how important social capital was in the community. It was really the networks that people had with the different stakeholders that was actually helping the refugees to get by in Grey and Bruce counties. Often it would require, in order to get, for example, an employer to hire a newcomer, it would require that personal touch. One of the sponsors would actually go and talk to the employer. Some migrants, or refugees rather, were quite concerned about their interactions with the police because in their country, law enforcement was a very scary and dangerous thing. But again, their sponsors or other volunteers helped them to overcome that through their personal connections. There was even one example I heard about where the police were invited to come and have dinner, actually, with a refugee family, just to kind of make everybody familiar and comfortable with one another. So it's that small town social capital that they were really able to use to their benefit, and they realized that, and they started to formalize it. And I just wanted to mention the latest developments, which is taking things to an even higher level of formalization by getting actual government support. So previously in the community, there were no settlement services, and by settlement services, I mean government-funded programs where migrants can go to get assistance finding a job, learning English. There was nothing like that. But because of the foundations they laid, they were able to successfully apply and get government-funded settlement supports in the community through the YMCA. They were also able to get to establish a local immigration partnership. And these are government-funded initiatives that are all about encouraging collaboration. So essentially, they got funding for the work they were already doing. So it's a very good news story in a way, and it's quite impressive what they've been able to achieve. And one of the things I found interesting about it wasn't just about helping the refugees, but it later became about making the community welcoming for everyone. And this was perceived very positively by immigrants who had arrived much earlier in the community and had felt invisible or felt that their culture was not valued, that nobody took an interest. Suddenly that changed. So something shifted in the consciousness of the community and the way they saw themselves. So as one person put it, she's a leader in the community and also a former migrant, newcomers coming into Grey Bruce area were not very visible until the Syrian crisis. But before that, we did have newcomers coming, and we did have sponsors. But because we didn't have the infrastructures, and there wasn't anybody talking about it in the public, just the need to have the infrastructure. So immigrants were just left with no support. So I think that quote really shows the importance of the work that was actually done in the counties, which I describe as very grassroots and very bottom-up. So I really wanted to show you the journey that they've gone through, just from meeting in the basement of a church all the way up to having the things that are often associated with larger cities and why immigrants might prefer larger cities, such as official settlement supports and funding for newcomer initiatives, and an actual community plan to increase diversity, inclusion, address racism. So this is probably a story that a number of communities have gone through, because there are these growing pains that communities have to find their way through, but no two stories are the same. You know, you have to work with your local resources, and Gray and Bruce really figured out what resources they had and how to work with them. And I think what's really amazing to come out of the story is that effectively they've changed the way they view belonging in the community. Now it's not about being necessarily white or Christian, because they also work, by the way, with mosques to sponsor refugees, but it's more about the community and its capacity to welcome, and they're very proud of that, which isn't to say there aren't ongoing problems, but I'll come back to that later. So now turning to Thunder Bay. Again, gorgeous place, really stunning. Thunder Bay has, as I mentioned, a bigger population and a long history of migration. So it began, there were indigenous people in the area previously, but then the fur trade came and the Coeur de Bois came from France, followed by English settlers. So there is a strong identity in Thunder Bay that goes back to those days, but migration continued into the city. There's been subsequent waves of different types of migrants coming in. And I've included here also this picture of Pioneer Village in Thunder Bay because, as I said, people are still somewhat not nostalgic for the days of the fur trade, but they still go to Thunder Bay to discover that and associate it with the city. But from the mid-20th century, there were a lot of resource-based activities, even prior to that, pardon me, going on in the region, which drew migrants from various European communities, and most notably Finnish people came. So to this day, Thunder Bay has one of the largest Finnish communities outside of Finland. Many came to work in mining and also forestry. And the city also attracted a number of Italian migrants who helped to build the railroads in the region and beyond. So you can see there on the left the picture of the Finnish bookstore. I took these photos myself, so still there. You can still get Finnish food as well in Thunder Bay. And then the Italian Cultural Center, which when I visited had a packed parking lot and was obviously very busy and active. So this is the cultural history of the region. And since then, more and more people have started to come. The city, or the area rather, the wider area of Thunder Bay is still engaging in resource-based economies like mining, but it's diversified a lot in recent years. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but it's a major hub in the region of Thunder Bay. Again, you may remember on the map, it's quite isolated. It's the only mid-sized city north of Sault Ste. Marie. So it serves a very wide area. And in fact, a lot of indigenous reserves have close ties to the city. So when they experience climate-related problems, that population from the north will come into Thunder Bay and require accommodation, restaurants, services. There's a lot of fly-in, fly-out activity happening around mining, for example. So there's a lot of people coming into the city requiring, again, things like hotels and restaurants. So there's demand for labor because of this. So many people international migrants have chosen to move to Thunder Bay for the jobs available. And the city's been all in for this. So not only have they tried to attract these international migrants through things like being a part of the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot, which I mentioned earlier. It is one of the designated sites. It's also a designated place for government sponsored refugees to receive services, and it's opened its universities to international students in a really big way. So just to give you a sense, I mentioned the population of Thunder Bay is around 115,000. The international student population is around 4,000. And until now has been on an upward trajectory, but we will see what happens given recent discussions around perhaps cutting back on international students. So this is just to give you an overall sense of the activities in the area. So Thunder Bay does have a lot of the things that I mentioned were initially lacking in Grey and Bruce counties, like settlement services. They have a whole multicultural center. They have a full range of settlement services and a lot of staff. That's something a much smaller community could only dream of. They have a better transportation system, not great, but they do have more buses and so on than most smaller communities. And they're more or less a complete city in the sense that you don't have to go outside it for anything because it's so isolated and it's a hub. Migrants can get what they need in a way that's often not possible in a smaller city. But this does not mean that they don't have major challenges when they move to Thunder Bay. And here I want to focus on the international students. And part of the reason for this is because so many have come in a short time, but also they're not eligible for government-funded settlement supports, which makes things extra challenging for them. So even though there might be all these resources invested into immigration, there might be all these amazing services, they can't take advantage of that because they're not considered immigrants, even though many of them do plan to stay. So many face challenges finding housing. They have to manage that on their own. And the housing market is very tough in Thunder Bay. There's a shortage, and a lot of students are looking for the same type of accommodation. There's only so much rental housing to go around, so that's been very difficult. There's also been growing competition for student jobs. So again, they're all looking for similar types of work. In other words, evening work or work that allows them to pursue their studies alongside employment. So it's been tough with so many international students coming in for some people to find jobs to support themselves. I already mentioned no access to services. And transportation, while better than in smaller communities, is still not great, especially considering how big the area is. And often students have to live really far from where they work and where they study. So quite often they need to go between a lot of different places. But luckily for those from India and certain other communities, there is established diasporic communities in the city of Thunder Bay that you don't normally find in smaller cities. So this is one benefit of the city being a bit larger and having that economy that attracts all different types of workers. So I mentioned that there's been a lot of Indian international students coming in, so that's why I'm focusing on them here. But I could also talk about other diasporic networks. For example, Karen refugees are very well established in Thunder Bay and have played an important role in bringing in more refugees, supporting families, supporting friends. In the case of the Indian international students, many have benefited from the Indian-focused organizations established by professional migrants that arrived in the city about 20 years ago. So you may be surprised to hear that in Thunder Bay, there is a mosque, there is a Hindu temple, and there is a Sikh temple. So these international students automatically have somewhere they can go. And these organizations, they anticipated this. When they saw numbers going up, they knew they were going to become the point organizations for students coming in. They even had parents calling them before the students even departed to Canada to say, "My child is coming, please help them." So they mobilized their own resources within the community, their networks, and started helping these students in a really big way. So by this I mean sometimes providing temporary accommodation, providing vegetarian meals because many Hindu students are vegetarian, making sure they could access that, making sure they could open a bank account, all these different things, basically providing services that the settlement sector would normally provide in a larger city. And I really think this is exceptional because often migrants go to bigger cities because they know they'll get this kind of support from their ethnic or diasporic community, but it turns out they can also find that in Thunder Bay. And I asked these people who were helping them why they were doing it. I was curious to know. And many of them said they could remember what it was like when they were migrants. They have been through a lot, but most of them are very successful now. They're well established, and they really want to give back. They want to support these students, and they're also excited to receive them because it means that their own community will grow, and this is good on for all different reasons. I also heard from one of the leaders that it's to their benefit that Thunder Bay isn't that big. So he made the comment that the Indian community in Thunder Bay is a small community, very small as compared to Toronto. So we're talking 2,000 plus people or so. But a good aspect of this is that everybody knows each other. They help each other. We are there for each other. So it's a little bit like in Grey and Bruce counties where those networks and who you know can be very, very valuable in terms of creating a welcoming community. By the way, that particular person started a cultural organization just in his own basement of his house in 2012, just with a couple families. And from there, he had to buy a building. And then from there, he had to buy another building. He opened a store inside his cultural organization, just to give you a sense of how the community has grown over time. He's also the organizer of the Indian Festival in Thunder Bay, and he's watched that grow exponentially over time. So you can imagine from the perspective of a student coming in how comforting this is to have a community to go to. When I was there, it was Navratri, which is an important festival for Hindus, but particularly Gujaratis. And there were so many events. I went to a couple, but it was every day for several days. And it just amazed me that they could offer that in such a small place, such a specific festival catering to one specific subset of the Indian population. But these communities also play a role in bridging students to the wider Canadian society, which is why I've included this funny photo, and I apologize, it looks like it's cut off, but they were advertising a Bollywood festival because I know this through my interviews. Many students were so excited to experience Halloween, but they also weren't that familiar with Canadian music or Canadian culture just yet, so this is the perfect combination because it's Bollywood music playing at a dress-up masquerade-style event. So, seemed perfect. Also, by having a community, the students felt like they could make their needs known to the wider society. So one student told me a lot of Indian students ended up missing cricket because cricket is a sport which is similar to what hockey is for Canada. In other words, very important. What they did together was they were able to approach the city of Thunder Bay. They were able to keep a park aside and then able to create a cricket patch or pitch, basically where students can come together and play. And my understanding is it's no longer just students that are taking part in cricket. It's the wider South Asian community. So it's building bridges between migrants from Pakistan and India and other parts of the South Asian diaspora. But it's also creating a lot of interest in the wider community as people want to know, what is all this fuss about? Cricket, let's learn what it is. So there's been other benefits for the broader community as well, because as these students graduate and are assisted by the diaspora, they have opportunities to start businesses, which in many cases are catering to the growing Indian diaspora. So there's been kind of an explosion of Indian restaurants. Full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of Indian food, and I have never eaten so well outside of India because the food there was really, really good. And it was really catering to recent migrants from India. So yeah, very, very spicy, which is how I like it. But this has also been great for the local community as well, because some of the locals also wanted to go and shop for spices and have the opportunity to go to Indian restaurants. And it's created new forms of community engagement as well. I mentioned previously the India Festival. So this is something that's attracted a lot of local attention. So just discussing a quote from the organizer of the festival. Our festivals are all inclusive. As I said, we get 9,000 people for the festival every year in July. There is not 9,000 people, not from India, staying in Thunder Bay. You can't count everybody. So he's estimating about 2,000 people. So the rest, 7,000, 8,000 people are non-Indian, local people. So you can see there is this appetite for diversity that maybe wasn't there in the past. And one participant told me that this is perhaps because some people have gone out of the community, perhaps spent some time in a more diverse place, and now they are more inclined to move back because they can have these diverse experiences even in a place like Thunder Bay. They don't necessarily need to move to Toronto anymore. So it's actually making the city more attractive on a cultural level to some people. And I just want to sort of wrap up the Thunder Bay case by saying that I've been talking about Indian migrants. That's just because that's the group that's moving right now. So I'm not suggesting that Thunder Bay is becoming, an Indian place per se. We have to put this in historical perspective. So I already mentioned the Finnish migrants coming who have left their footprint on the landscape. Italian migrants. This photo here is from the folklore festival, actual Italian dancers dancing in Thunder Bay. So they're trying to keep the culture alive. And then in the future, it might be different groups of migrants. It might be Ukrainian migrants that are doing similar things to what the Indian migrants are doing right now. And I have interviewed migrants from different communities, and actually some of them said, what are the Indian people doing in these smaller towns? It's not just Thunder Bay. There's a lot of Indian migration across Canada right now, so you do see these pockets of diasporic activity. How did they do it? It looks like they're getting established. It looks like they're so successful. How can we do that? We want our community to be like that. So I just wanted to mention that this is part of a broader process where communities come in, they settle, they establish themselves, and are in a position to contribute to the society while also holding on to their broader identities. So I just want to now just conclude a few points. The regionalization of immigration presents challenges, of course, and I've touched on a number of those. Maybe I've been more positive than negative during this presentation. You can tell me during the Q&A. But I really want to emphasize that there are so many opportunities with immigration. We've seen firsthand the positive impacts on the labor market, the positive impacts on demographics, reversing those aging trends. And what I find most interesting and most important is really the impact on the social and cultural domain. It's making people more aware of a world beyond themselves. And we can see these transformations taking place. And I think that's really exciting. And most communities have really done this on their own. Of course, from the top, government policy plays a role, but immigration to smaller communities doesn't work unless the community is behind it and they mobilize to make it work, because it is hard. There are these challenges that need to be overcome. There's obviously growing pains. But as I hope I've outlined today, there are ways to overcome these challenges. And I think I've given you a few examples of how they actually can be overcome and how this can lead to a win-win situation for not only migrants, but also the communities that receive them. And then the third point is just really that change is constant. And those arriving today may well be the ones welcoming newcomers in the years to come, as I think I've emphasized. And just a note on that, if you are interested in attending the Folklore Festival, it's next month. So you can start planning your trip to Thunder Bay, because I hope I've sold it really well. Because of the Folklore Festival, some people affectionately refer to Thunder Bay as the Toronto of the North when it comes to diversity. So, all right, so I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Check, check. Sound check, 1, 2.
Thank you. Melissa, do you want to take a seat so you can relax while people ask you questions? Who'd like to open? Nedra's over here, I'm here. Whoa. Anybody want to ask the first question? Okay.
Hi there. I'm a little surprised that you didn't dwell more on how involved religious communities have been in welcoming and bringing people into smaller communities.
Yes, I mean, absolutely they are. You're right. And this is in part because of the sponsorship model when it comes to refugees. It's easier for churches to sponsor. So that's just sort of how it's been set up. And then, yeah, so definitely in the Graham Bruce case, it was mostly churches bringing people in and the mosque as well. But yes, also in the second case with the Indian migrants, it's very much all based around the religious organizations. I will say, though, that that doesn't have to be seen as exclusive, because a lot of the students I spoke with were more than happy to engage with all the different religions. So wherever there was something happening, they would go. So it was more that these religious organizations served as hubs that offered a certain package of activities and events and festivals. And if they wanted to, they could go to the ones at Indian-focused churches, temples, mosques, all of it. So, yeah.
Melissa, can I ask a question about retention? Can you share with us some of your findings about whether people are staying once they go to these smaller centers, or if they're eventually heading back to the TMV?
MTV, yeah. Same idea.
Toronto-centric, right?
No, thanks for that. Actually, so what I discussed today was a couple different studies that I've carried out, and I was trying to look at sort of the links between them. But the Graham Bruce study was actually focused on retention. So I deliberately went into the communities and asked to speak with people who had been there for a long time and why they stayed. And in many cases, it was that they had married someone from the region, that they liked the lifestyle, that they could no longer afford to move back to Toronto, their children were happy there. But when I asked the organizations serving migrants, they said there's still a lot of people that leave. It's sort of, I don't have the statistics, unfortunately, but their perception was, 50 in, 50 out kind of thing. It's like a constant flow of people coming in and out of the community. But their hope is that now that they've built this infrastructure, the settlement supports and everything, people that would have left in the past will now have more reason to stay, because some of their most basic needs will now be met versus in the past they weren't. And remember, Graham Bruce counties, they don't have these diasporic communities that I was discussing in Thunder Bay. So that's a huge disadvantage. That's why I said they have to start from the bottom up. It's really on the community to organize that and to make it happen. And Graham Bruce is doing that. So I'm optimistic that although they've faced retention challenges, that's going to turn around. And I think the same is probably true for other communities that are doing similar, making similar efforts. Someone over there.
I was wondering, is there an Ontario provincial government umbrella organization that is helping this in small communities?
There's an umbrella organization for settlement services, but until you have settlement services, you're not really part of that, right? So it's on the communities to really get things going. So I kind of glossed over this, but what Graham Bruce have built up to is the establishment of a local immigration partnership. And these organizations exist across Canada, and the goal there is really to bring together all the different stakeholders and try to help people collaborate effectively across sectoral boundaries and so on. So it's not an umbrella organization per se, but it is a way of working that has created a bigger conversation because the lips across the country talk to each other, they exchange best practices. As I mentioned, these initiatives have to be place-specific because every community has different challenges. There may be similarities, but the specifics are different. They have different challenges and they have different resources at their disposal. So while they can learn from each other, there's no off-the-shelf solution. I hope that answers your question.
In terms of retention, we've all heard stories of physicians driving taxis in downtown Toronto because they can't get their credentials approved. Is that improving? What is happening on that front specifically for the professions? Because we need doctors,
Yes.
especially.
Yeah, I know. It's been such a serious challenge, not only for smaller communities, but for larger cities like Toronto, as you pointed out, right? So my sense is that things are improving, but I have nothing super positive to report today. But I hope, it's a conversation that's been going on for decades. It's really time to take action. I completely agree. It's one of the biggest issues facing integration in this country, and
Specifically on the medical side,
yes.
do you know if the medical associations are working hard on this problem? Because they're the ones who were running a closed shop
Yes,
and will have to open that shop and haven't wanted to do that very badly in the past, but our demand surely is putting pressure on that. Is there movement there?
Oh, I hear you.
I hear the wrong answer.
No. I mean, full disclosure, I used to work in that area for the federal government. Yeah, so I understand the issues, but, unfortunately, there's only so much you can do from a policy side. These regulating bodies really have to open up somehow. Yeah.
Maybe this would be a good time to allow David Piccini to say a few words, who is the Minister for Ontario of Immigration, and also the Cobourg, Port Hope, Northumberland County MPP. So,
Thank you. Happy to answer that. Melissa, great job on just anecdotally your importance on culture, and I think somebody asked a question about religion. I often ask people who's the best physician recruiter in the Bowmanville, Clarington catchment area, and people often think to themselves, who's the physician recruiter? The actual best physician recruiter is Dr. Rashid, who started the mosque there, and he's helped recruit a number of doctors, some of whom are practicing in Northumberland right now. So interesting on the importance of culture and religion and the cultural diaspora. My grandson of an Italian immigrant who landed where the culture was, where the family members were. A couple interesting questions, though. We do have a regional immigration pilot program in Ontario. Chatham-Kent and Cornwall are two examples of the areas where we're incentivizing people to go through our employer express entry employer job stream through the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program. And your question on doctors, that's with the regulatory bodies. Ontario has a fairness commissioner, and two things have changed. One, now in Ontario it's a law, our regulatory bodies have to respond within 60 days to an international trainee. The idea that my cabbie's a doctor really is the impetus behind that. And then you have 6 months in which to assess. And if you're missing competency, we have skills training programs to bridge the gap. The College of Nurses are a great example. They've been a big response. 9,000 internationally trained nurses joined the ranks of Ontario's nursing workforce last year. So that's a tangible example of that benefiting over the last sort of 2 years. And then sneak peek for legislation we're introducing next month. We'll be giving the Fairness Commissioner additional powers to compel regulatory bodies on timelines. And that ranges from nurses who are doing a great job, CPSO, but you need to recruit and ensure people are practicing to their full potential in Ontario.
thank you, David. Melissa, could you tell us a little bit about what you've learned, comparatively speaking, from your research on other countries like New Zealand and Australia that you mentioned?
Oh,
In
that's a work in progress, but thank you for asking. There are common policy issues between all three countries, which is why we decided to work together. So basically, all three countries are actively trying to bring international migrants to smaller centers, and all face the challenge of retaining people once they do that. So that's, we are carrying out the research and hoping to share best practices, but unfortunately, I don't have anything to report just yet.
How are they doing compared to us?
The issues, like I said, are very similar, and also the recent discussion around reducing migration has occurred across all three countries almost at the same time, which I find really interesting. So there's even common discourses and common sort of trajectories happening across the three countries. In terms of who's doing better, it's really hard to say. It's nuanced. In terms of international student migration, Australia was a little bit ahead of us, so they realized a little bit sooner some of the challenges, and yet we still chose to go down that path, which is interesting because there's a lot of parallels there. New Zealand is more trying to learn what Australia and Canada are doing. They've been a little less aggressive in their approach, but they want to get on board, basically. They want to ensure that they have the labor force they need in smaller cities as well. So they're very keen to adopt some of our best practices if they can.
I think I'm next. Have you, given your very upbeat talk, I thought it was wonderful, and your research is really great. And given the numerous immigrant groups, festivities, and socialization, have you noticed a trend in intercultural marriages or interfaith marriages or inter-immigrant marriages? I don't know how you phrase that. I think that'd be fascinating to discuss or to watch, to see where we end up. Where are we going to be in 20, 50 years? Yeah.
For sure, yeah. Thank you for that question. It's an interesting one for sure. I mean, if you look at a city like Toronto, you can definitely see that is the trend. As I mentioned, in Grey and Bruce counties, I interviewed people who had been there for a long time, and many of them were in mixed marriages. So the reason they wound up there is because their partner was originally from there. So maybe they met in some global city somewhere like Singapore, but then settled in those communities. A lot of the participants were in that situation. Not so much the case with the recent migrants in Thunder Bay because they were so recent, right? So many of them were hoping to marry somebody who was also Indian. They hadn't really, looked too much beyond that cultural boundary just yet. Yeah, so I think it depends a little on how long you've been in the place and how comfortable you are.
Hi, thank you for your talk, very interesting. I just wondered if you could comment on the younger children of the immigrants, so those that would go to elementary school or high school, different challenges, or how easily were they integrated?
I'm so glad you asked that because I forgot to mention that in the presentation. I got carried away with other things. This is a gap. This is a very serious gap. It sounded to me like a lot of the adults were doing just fine, for example, in Grey and Bruce counties, but they were concerned about their children because there's a lot of bullying that goes on in schools, and many parents feel like this isn't being addressed as an integration challenge. It's just being brushed off as what kids do.
What about like integrating them into sports, teaching them hockey, softball, that sort of thing? Do they consciously try and do that, or they've got so many things they're trying to do they don't get to that?
Yeah, I got the sense people were generally overwhelmed, and also I did some of this research during the pandemic, so that wasn't even an option. People were spending a lot of time at home. But a lot of younger migrants are so busy and stressed, they don't even have time for themselves to make friends. They actually thought about their social lives less than I anticipated, because it was more about getting their career off the ground, buying a house, getting settled, right? They were very concerned with these basic necessities. I did ask them how they felt about raising their kids in Canada, and some of the responses were interesting. Some of them had concerns about losing the faith that they were brought up with, for example, because they could see that Canada was a less religious place. Some of the values, some of the ways of being were also of concern. For example, the prevalence of smoking marijuana was concerning to some of the participants, things like that. But overall, they were very happy to have the chance to raise their children here, and they believed that they would have more opportunities in the long run.
I hate to keep asking questions, but I'm interested, so hope you don't mind. I have some experience as a private sponsor of a Syrian family in 2016 in Toronto, where there are tons of social services. And I was fascinated to hear about the people in Grey Bruce who were, really starting, as you said, from the bottom up. Is there anything you can tell us about the response to the newcomers to being handed off to, a service center versus the very, intimate relationship that you can have and how with a sponsor, and how that plays out over time?
Great question, thank you. I think those intimate relationships are overall very positive and very valuable to the refugees coming in. It gives them that connection to the community that would have been impossible to have otherwise, perhaps, or it would have taken much longer, let's say. But it's hard to know what people really think, because there's this certain culture of gratitude that they feel they must subscribe to. So when you ask privately sponsored refugees about their experiences, they almost only say positive things. Versus economic migrants, I find, are a bit more honest and forthcoming. They have certain expectations, and they'll tell you which ones haven't been met. The sponsored refugees feel like they owe the sponsor something, they owe the community something. And perhaps it takes time to overcome that, for them to actually reflect on what they want and what they need, versus maybe if the sponsors weren't there, they would have a little bit more agency in that sense. And I should mention that despite the extremely warm welcome from sponsors, and believe me, I don't mean to undermine that, I think it's absolutely phenomenal, some refugees still choose to leave, because despite that, they're still looking for that bigger community, family connections, those sorts of things. So sponsors can only fill the void to a certain extent. And sometimes people still prefer to be around people that understand them completely, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Does anyone in our audience tonight have any experience as a sponsor or as a welcoming community member for migrants who ended up in Northumberland County, and would they like to say a few words? No?
I'd love to hear about your experiences.
Paul?
Well, I have some experience, particular with when we had our Vietnamese boat people, and we sponsored a couple of families locally. It was an interesting experience, but I wasn't really close enough to the actual individuals to know how they were reacting to us. But overall, it was a community effort. It was well thought out, and I think at the end, I remember them buying a house, and they filled every room with either members of their family or friends, and they ultimately paid for that house, and their children went off to university, and it was a very happy story as far as I'm concerned.
Wow, that's a good way to end tonight, I guess. Right? We came in here worrying so much about housing for students and so on, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel, we hope, and we've got Minister Piccini here to further the discussion, and I know that it's one that's very much on the minds of most Ontarians and Canadians, in fact. So first of all, thank you so much, Melissa, for this really interesting review of migration to areas like our own. And thank you, David, for coming out tonight and joining us. I know many of us have our own anecdotes of dealing with new Canadians that are close to us or who we meet at work or on the streets, and this is Canada. It's always been that way. And as you concluded, change is constant, and those arriving today may well be the ones of welcoming newcomers in the years to come, and I hope we all play an important part in that. So thank you very much for your words tonight, and thank you, Mark, for bringing Melissa to us. Okay, so next week. There is no event. So I just want to remind you, don't come here next Thursday night. The following week, we have another event on a really interesting, different spin on the whole migration subject, and it's via Zoom only. So there is no in-person. We're speaking with Kamal Al-Soyeli, who is the director of the School of Journalism at UBC and an acclaimed author, and he's going to be joining us on Zoom from UBC. Or from BC, I should say, and he's going to explore something that's really common but frequently misunderstood, and that's the desire to return to the homeland. Maybe not to the big city, but actually to the homeland. And he has some interesting points to make about that, and will offer some stories and historical analysis. And he will be moderated by another one of our community program committee members, Mary Ladke. And then the following day, Mary's going to also take the reins and run a book club discussion on the subject of migrating for a job that's completely outside your comfort zone. There's a book called Ducks that was written by Kate Beaton when she, as a young woman, moved from Ontario to the oil sands and lived there for a few years, and how that idea of migrating is, again, it's ducks too, so that's something we're going to segue to in our last couple of events, which will be on the natural world, when we'll be back here starting on May 2nd. So thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. And thank you again, Melissa, and I hope you have a great weekend. Good night.